All right, here we are getting started with our first lecture here for Biology 241. So this class is Human Anatomy and Physiology, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. This first chapter is to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be covering in this class throughout the rest of the quarter. So this is a class on anatomy and physiology. As you go through these, I would recommend printing out the copy of these that I do give you in your online classroom, so that you can put any notes you want as you go with it. They are left in a modifiable form so that if you would like to type your additional notes in afterwards, you can, if you like to keep things all neat and clean. So in here we're looking at anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is the study of the structures. It's a lot of naming things. Sometimes it's called morphology. Physiology is the study of the functions of living organisms. Fortunately, in here we do teach them together. That makes it a little bit easier to remember the anatomy. Anatomy alone is a lot of memorizing, and there is plenty of that in here. However, if you are looking at the physiology with it, it makes it a little bit easier because it at least gives you a reason to remember things. So we look at the structures and functions together. They are interrelated. Basically, if you have a part, there's a reason for it. We don't have any parts that there is not a reason or that have absolutely zero function. We may not completely understand the function, and there are parts that we thought in the past that didn't really have a function, but we've generally learned that that was not the case, that there was a reason for it. So this implies that they're interrelated or that functions dependent on structure. So that makes them really inseparable sciences when we look at it that way, that there is a reason for every part that you have. So when we look at anatomy, there's several different topics that we can study anatomy by. Gross anatomy is just looking at the large structures that you can see with the naked eye. So that's going to be things on the outside. Works great for the outside of the body, doesn't really help you study what's on the inside. When you do go in, if you go on to do professional graduate level work in clinical sciences, a lot of times you're going to study anatomy from more than one perspective. You may study systemic anatomy and then also regional anatomy, and the advantage of that is it gets to see how things interact in different ways. So with regional anatomy, you're looking at the structures that are located in a particular region of the body. So one may look at the core, torso of the body, another one may look at the head, and then another one at the arms and legs. With systemic anatomy, we base it on the different systems of the body. That's how we're going to be breaking things down in this class, is it will go by the different systems. Surface anatomy looks at the internal structures as they relate to the overlying skin. This can actually be really useful in clinical situations because if you can see landmarks of where things are on the outside to know what is underneath, it certainly is a lot more comfortable for the patient than saying, well, you know what, we got to peel off your skin to see where your liver is, where if you can recognize landmarks on the skin and know that that's what you're over, that's going to be a much better scenario. Microscopic anatomy, it's going to look at structures that are too small to see with the naked eye, microscopic things. Cellular anatomy, this can be a whole huge branch in itself, just studying the different types of cells of the body and the different parts of the cell. And histology looks at the different types of tissues. Tissues, for the most part, are microscopic, so it does involve a lot of microscope work. Developmental anatomy looks at how an organism changes over time, basically from conception to old age. Embryology just looks at the parts that occur before birth, and that can be a whole separate science in itself. So a lot of these different sciences do get scientific names. Cyto means cell. Cytology is the study of cells. Histo is tissues. Histology is the study of tissues. Then there are even more specialized branches out there looking at pathological anatomy. These would be changes that have occurred in the cells, tissues, or the organs as a result of disease. Radiographic anatomy, this is looking at the structure specifically on X-rays and other imaging techniques. And then functional morphology is going to study the functional properties of the structures and their efficiency of design. So the pathology and radiography tend to be separate professions in themselves, where a person would specialize in just one or the other of those fields. So when we look at the hierarchy of the structure of organization, things are organized from the most basic level down at the chemical level, all the way on up to the whole organism. And so each level is organized and then combined to make the next level. So at the chemical level, you have atoms that are going to combine to form your small molecules, things like carbon dioxide and water. Then we also have the larger macromolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So you have your smaller chemical level, and then they will combine to make your larger macromolecules. Those are made of several smaller molecules. Then the cellular level, this is the smallest living unit. We don't have anything smaller than a cell that's actually alive. So viruses are not considered alive. We look at cells and their functional subunits called the organelles. When we look at the tissues, these are groups of cells that are going to have a characteristic function together. We have 4 main types of tissues in the human body: epithelium, muscle, connective tissue, and nervous tissue. Organs are going to be made of at least 2 tissue types that will perform a specific physiological process. So for example, if you look at your heart, it's going to have muscle tissue in there. It's going to be cardiac muscle. It's going to have epithelium that's going to make up the membranes, connective tissue holding it together, and nerve tissue in there that's going to tell it what to do. When we look at the organism level, you have all the organs cooperating with one another to perform a common function, which is keeping that organism alive. So here we're looking at parts of the cardiovascular system. So the way that it is presented in this class, there are 11 human organ systems. Sometimes this can be broken down where some of those in the circulatory system will be broken down into subsystems, and it will look like there's up to 14 systems. It's not that one is better than the other or right or wrong. It's just different ways of doing it. So the organism is the highest level of organization of looking at specific organisms. There are higher organizations of life looking at the whole entire planet. We're not getting into those in this class. So at this level, life is sustained by the efforts of the simpler levels. So we do have functions that are necessary for life. We have to maintain boundaries. So we have membranes that are going to do this so we can determine what's inside the organism, what is not part of the organism. Organisms need to have movement, whether it be locomotion, moving arms and legs, or even on a microscopic level, moving substances within cells. There's responsiveness. They have the ability to sense change that's going on in their environment, as well as to react to those changes. They're going to do digestion. They have to have a way of taking in nutrients, breaking them down, and delivering them through the body. And then those are going to go on to a smaller level, which is metabolism, which looks at all of the different chemical reactions within the body. In this class, we will look at select metabolic reactions in there, but we do not look at a comprehensive view of all the metabolic reactions. That would just be way too intensive for a class that's 2 quarters long. Living things are going to need to do excretion. They need to be able to eliminate the waste products that you don't need anymore. They're also going to be able to reproduce to ensure that there are future generations, and then there'll be growth. It will either be increasing the cell size or the cell number. So this is essential. It's not very practical to think of us giving birth to a full-size organism. Things that we actually need to survive. You're going to need your nutrients. This is going to provide the chemicals needed for energy and building cells. They fall into some major categories: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. Oxygen is required for a lot of these chemical reactions. Water is a significant component of the body. It's 60 to 80% of the body weight, and it's going to provide a medium for a lot of the metabolic reactions to occur in, as well as participate them. It helps to create a stable body temperature. And then the atmospheric pressure must also be appropriate. It's one we don't often think about because where we live, the atmospheric pressure really changes very little for us. However, we would not be able to go live miles down deep in the ocean. The pressure would be too great. Homeostasis is the ability of the body to maintain a relatively stable set of internal conditions even though the outside world is changing. We say it's a state of dynamic equilibrium because it's going to function within relatively narrow limits, but there is some up and down in there in those limits. All the body systems are going to contribute to this maintenance. So having this be unbalanced is one of the causes of disease. So there's three interdependent components that help to maintain this. We have receptors that are going to detect changes in the environment. The control center is going to determine the response. And then the effector is going to be how the body actually responds to whatever that stimulus is. So this is accomplished through the nervous and endocrine systems. So we start out with this stimulus. It's going to produce some sort of change in the system. And it gets detected by a receptor. And that information is going to be sent along an afferent pathway to the control center. The control center is generally in your central nervous system. A lot of times it's not something you have conscious control of or conscious awareness of. Then it's going to send an output along an efferent pathway to an effector. It's going to be a motor response. It's going to tell the body what it needs to do in order to adapt or change what's going on with that stimulus. Most of the time we have negative feedback mechanisms in our body. What these are going to do is it's going to sense a change and basically try to reverse it, bring things back to the center line. It's going to decrease the intensity of the stimulus or possibly eliminate it. So this would be similar to your home heating thermostat. If it gets too hot in the house, you're going to kick on the AC. If it gets too cold, you kick on the heat, but you want to keep it in this narrow range that is comfortable for you. Positive feedback mechanisms, these are going to enhance or exaggerate the original stimulus, so it would accelerate the activity. These are actually not very common in the body. There is only a couple of prime examples of these. It's going to result in the change occurring in the same direction as the original stimulus. So blood clotting or childbirth are two examples of these. If you spring a leak in the system, you need to have the blood thicken and begin to clot. Otherwise, it's going to continue to leak. Same thing with childbirth. If you don't intensify the uterine contractions, you're not going to get that baby out of there. So it's not really the thing that most people are aiming for during childbirth. They'd usually like to get it out sooner rather than later. So this is just showing here having the tear in the blood vessels. The clotting would occur as the platelets are going to start to adhere to that area. They're also going to send out chemicals to call in more platelets. They're going to call in for help. And this clotting is going to proceed until you finally form enough of a clot to block things off. So the language of anatomy and physiology is really important that you start to incorporate this as part of your everyday language. You don't want to have to stop and think, what do these terms mean? Just like when you're pointing at something, you can say right and left, and you don't have to stop and think about it a whole lot. That's where you want to be with these terms. So these terms help give us position, direction, establish region, and structures in the body. They're really useful to eliminate confusion. So to get our reference point, we look at what is the anatomical position. It's the body standing erect, the feet together, the arms are at the side, and the palms are forward. So this palms forward is essential on here. If the person wasn't standing, we would say it was the toes are pointed down. So the directional terms are used in anatomy to reference any changes from this anatomical position. When we use the terms right and left, we're always referring to the body's right and left, whether it be a cadaver, a living person, a patient, whatever. It's the body's right and left, not the viewer's right and left. So when we look at the different regions of the body, there's two main divisions. The axial part of the body is going to include the head, neck, and trunk. And then the appendicular is going to be the arms and legs. The shoulder and pelvis are included in this. Then we can also have regional terms to designate specific areas within the major division. So the carpal area for the wrists, oral for the mouth, femoral for the thigh. There are several of these. So here you can see you've got the axial skeleton. Within there you've got the head and neck. The trunk region would include the thorax, abdomen, and the pelvis and perineum. You have the upper limb here, the lower limb. Both of those are part of the appendicular skeleton. So this picture here gives you all of these different regions in there. So pedal is the foot. And then within the foot, you've got the tarsal, which would be the ankle, calcaneal for the heel, metatarsal over the foot, digital for the toes, plantar is on the bottom surface, hallux is going to be the big toe. Same thing with the lower limb, coxal for the hip, femoral for the thigh, patellar for the knee, popliteal is behind the knee, sural for the calf, and then fibular or peroneal is going to be along this surface here of the leg, more on the front. And then fibular is along the side. So manus for the hands, pollex for the thumb, metacarpal over the hand region. The palm is this bottom surface, and then the digital is the fingers. For the upper limb, we've got the acromial that is over this region here where you have your deltoids, brachial for the upper arm, antecubital is in front of the elbow here, antebrachial is the forearm, and then carpal for the wrist. So for the cephalic for the head, got frontal, orbital, nasal, oral, and mental. So mental's down here at the chin, frontal up here at the forehead. Cervical is the neck. With the thoracic, you've got the sternal here in the middle. Axillary is near the armpit. Mammary is around the breast tissue. For the abdominal area, and then you've got the umbilical here in the center. The pelvic area, then the inguinal or groin, and then the pubic area for the genitals. On the posterior side, here you've still got the cephalic, otic over the ears, occipital is on the back of the head, still the cervical. On the back or dorsal, you've got the scapular region, vertebral region, lumbar region, sacral region, gluteal region, and then the perineal between the anus and external genitals. So when we use the term superior, cranial, or cephalid, or cephalic, for a lot of these terms there are more than one correct term for them. You will tend to see them used, all of them used. I tend to use the superior, inferior, and stay away from the Greek-sounding ones. I think it makes it a little bit easier while you're learning, but you do need to be aware that they are all out there and that they're all considered correct terms to use. So cephalic, superior, is going to be towards the head. Inferior caudal is going to be away from the head towards the bottom part of the body, sometimes meaning towards the tail. You can use it to describe things relative to one another. Navel is inferior to the breastbone. Anterior ventral is towards the front of the body. Posterior dorsal is towards the back side of the body. And medial is towards the midline of the body. So you would say the heart is medial to the arms. Lateral is going to be towards the sides. So you could say the arms are lateral to the chest. Intermediate is between a more medial and more lateral structure. So the armpit would be considered intermediate between the breastbone and the shoulder. Proximal is closer to the origin of the body or the core, the part where it's going to attach to the trunk. So you could say that your elbow is proximal to the wrist. Distal is farther from that origin or the core of the body. You could say that the knee is distal to the thigh. These two terms here you really want to be familiar with. These we use for the arms and the legs. We use these more than superior or an inferior because then we don't have any contradictions if the body is laying in something other than anatomical position. So you just want to make that association. Proximal and distal go with the arms and the legs. Superficial is towards the surface. Deep is towards the internal part of the body. Lungs are deep to the rib cage would be an example. Then we can have the body planes or sections. So most of the time these are at right angles to each other, so we can have 3 different planes. It's going to bear the name of the plane of the section on which it's cut. This is really useful because it gives the frame of reference of the view that you're looking at. So if you imagine you are looking in one window of a room and your friend is looking in another room on another side of the house, in that other window in there, and you look in that room, you're both looking in the same room, but one of you looks and says, you know what, that couch on that back wall is really ugly. To your friend, that's not necessarily going to be the back wall. That might be the side wall. Their back wall has another couch that's really pretty. And so if you're not on the same page, one of you is looking and thinks one wall is the back wall, the other one thinks the different wall is the back wall, you're not in the same frame of reference. That's why we want to have these body planes, so that we can be talking about the same thing at the same time. So they're often sectioned or cut along a flat surface. So these are going to go through the anatomical portions of the body. Frontal plane is going to divide things into front and back. Your median, sagittal, or mid-sagittal plane is going to divide things into right and left parts. We say it's mid-sagittal when it's equal right and left parts. And then the transverse plane is going to cut things into top and bottom parts. So with frontal, you've got an anterior and posterior section. It is sometimes called coronal when it's referencing the head. The transverse, it runs horizontally, so it can cut things into cross sections. It does not necessarily have to be at the waist. It could be at the thigh, it could be at the knee, at the mid-arm, so these can occur various different places. The sagittal plane, it's going to divide into right and left parts. So when it's mid-sagittal, it's going to be equal. Right and left parts are right exactly in the middle. So then we can have planes that are going to be diagonally. These would be your oblique sections. They're not used very often because those 3 main planes of reference actually work really well and don't give a lot of confusion. So if you look at this and you were to try and decide, okay, I'm going to make a sagittal cut on a banana. I'm going to make a transverse cut on a banana. This would help in understanding the different spatial relationships. So you don't necessarily have to go cut up a bunch of fruit for it, but next time you take your apple and it's sitting on the counter, if you have the choice to eat it whole or cut it up, cut it up. Talk to yourself as you're going through it. The more you kind of talk through these things, make them part of your everyday language, the easier they are to use in anatomy and physiology. So take advantage of that because not everything will come as easy as learning these terms. So this is a frontal view of an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. So here you can see the various organs. So these can be done and show different planes like this. The advantage to this is you can see a lot of what's going on in this body without actually having to make a cut in this person. So it's a non-invasive procedure, much safer for them. This is a transverse view. So this is going through, it's cutting through their abdominal area. So you can see the liver, spinal cord, the aorta, stomach, spleen, and then the subcutaneous fat layers. So this can help see how things are distributed within the body cavity. And here you've got a mid-sagittal view, so it will let you see some of the internal structures of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So it lets you see things that are above and below or superior or inferior to each other. So of course with the body cavities, we have our main cavities and then several subcavities within these. The 2 main ones are the dorsal and the ventral. So you'll notice here with the dorsal cavity, it does include all of the head. The reason for that is during embryological development, you have anterior and posterior tissues. The posterior tissue folds over to make your brain. They are wrapped all in one membrane system, and that's how they're all lumped together. So then you have your thoracic cavity that is part of your ventral cavity. separated by the diaphragm, the abdominal cavity, the pelvic cavity. Within the thoracic cavity, you have the mediastinum. This is going to be the area where the heart sits, in between the lung and the pleural cavity. Within the pelvic cavity here, you have the bladder, reproductive organs, and the peritoneal cavity. So your serous membranes, or serosa, are going to be a thin double-layered membrane. It's going to cover the ventral body cavity and the outer surface of the organs. So we have visceral and parietal pleura, or serosa. Pleura would be the example for the lungs. So parietal serosa is going to be the layer of the membrane that's going to line off the walls of the cavity. Visceral is actually going to be attached to the organ itself. And then serous fluid is going to be between those two serous membranes. So these specific serous membranes get named for the cavity where they're found. So pericardium surrounds the heart, pleura surrounds the lungs, peritoneum is going to cover the abdominal cavity. So sometimes they use a balloon model to try and explain how this works. If you were imagine taking a balloon that's inflated and putting your fist into the balloon, you're going to have part of the balloon cover your fist, and it's going to be attached right to the surface. And then you're going to have also this covering that's around it, but there is a gap in between. And that's going to be how all of these are set up around the organs. So it's a double layer. In here is where you would have that fluid, or on this place it's showing air in the example of the balloon. In the body, you don't really have big gaps of air like that. So in addition to the large closed body cavities, we have several types of smaller cavities: oral cavities, nasal cavities, orbital cavities for the eyes, middle ear cavities, synovial cavities around synovial joints. This is showing some of these other cavities. So orbital, around the orbits, are the eyes. Nasal cavity, middle ear cavity. So you can see they're actually connected in there. Oral cavity for the mouth. And then here would be a synovial cavity in a synovial joint. So the abdominal area can be a little bit large to have to identify things on. If you find something and you need to be able to describe where it is, that's when you would use these terms. And this picture here lets you see what's in the different cavities. If you have a good picture of this in your mind, then you don't necessarily need to memorize this list. You can usually figure it out if you know what the terms are just by picturing what's underneath the skin. So across the top, we have the right hypochondriac, epigastric, and left hypochondriac. In the middle, right lumbar, umbilical, and left lumbar. And then along the bottom, right iliac, hypogastric, and left iliac regions. So this system would work great unless you found something, say, right here or right here. If it's where the lines cross, it's not going to be ideal, so we do have another system we can use when the lines cross. The quadrants. So it's a more generalized scheme. The names are easier to remember. You've got the right and left upper quadrants, right and left lower quadrants. If you're the one describing where something is, you can use whichever system you feel is appropriate. If you've got something right here, it doesn't really matter if you're using the quadrant or the system that has the 9 regions. You pick whichever one is your preference in there. If you've got something right in the middle, the umbilical from the 9 regions is going to work better than the quadrants. You just need to understand when somebody else is describing something using these tools. So we do have a lot of advanced imaging systems out there. It allows us to study internal structures without disrupting the tissue. In most cases, the harm to the patient is very minimal. Some of them do have some harm done. It's usually going to be in the form of radiation. But that's the reason why you don't take imaging studies just for curiosity's sake. It is going to be less invasive than actually cutting open a body. So light micrograph, this is a fancy name for something that you would look at underneath the light microscope. Light microscope would be the typical classroom microscope. So transmission electron micrograph. This allows you to do a slice and see the internal structures, where the scanning electron micrograph is going to allow you to see the surface. This can enlarge things much larger than a light microscope with the electron microscope. X-rays. So this is going to show things, and you're going to see the contrast based on the different densities of the tissue. So here where it's black, that's where you have air. Bone has more density in there. It's going to appear more metallic. Calcium is metallic, and that's what's going to make the white. So if you had a piece of metal on the person, you would see it as very vibrant white on an X-ray image. Computerized tomography, or CT. So this will allow you to see things inside of the body. It can give, depending on if contrast or other things are used, it can give different appearances to things inside the body. Digital subtraction angiography. So these can be really useful to be able to see blood supply going through blood vessels, so you can see where things are narrowed and see where a clot could be happening. So PET scans, positron emission tomography. So this again will allow you to see differences in some of the tissue types or organs without being invasive into the body. Sonography, this is going to use sound waves to establish the gross structure of things. This isn't going to show you microscopic stuff, but it can be useful to see gross structures. It can allow you to determine, is there a mass or a cyst in tissue. MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging. So these can be done using different types of contrast in here. These really are pretty harmless to the body. They use a giant magnet to come up with the imaging in there. So those are just a few examples of different types of images. And reading the images is a whole separate science in itself. It's generally a separate profession where the images are read. Most of the time, somebody's able to do a quick scan of the images, but a lot of times you're going to have the radiologist actually read the images, who looks at them all day long.